Whether or not this building can be saved, I don't know. These two buildings right next to it are a good case in point. J. Wood designed both these buildings, and they were at one point just alike. Friedlander's, of course, was also gorgeous at one point. Amazing how noisy it is out here. Starman took this building over and restored it in renovated it in 1926. There's 26. It was at one time 3 separate buildings. Starman started in 1885 across the street. In this building, that's what that Starman Brothers 1885 means, SB. Of course, it's now Courthouse. And A.T. McIntyre built this as his law office. Also in 1885. And of course, the gift shop. Of course, Marianne's Needlework is a gorgeous building too. And a lot of architects seem to think that this was added later, but it wasn't. It was original. I have a lot of photographs that show it. Of course, this what was the bank. Of course, the Bank of Thomasville, First National Bank. Mount Henderson Jewelry. These buildings, of course, were built earlier than they're here. The smokehouse was originally had a very different floor, second floor, and where this was where A.W. Mahler's office was at one point. I tore this building down to build a filling station. Of course, the poor old Mitchell house is only a pale shadow of its former self. The church building, the library. Commercial bank building that's referred to now as the Commercial Bank Building, which is of course the annex to the courthouse, was built as a Bank of Thomasville back in 1926. Kind of difficult to film this side of the street. The old James Watt hardware store, of course, was remodeled extensively. Pressed jewelry, old Lowe Theater, which has been changed extensively. McClellan's, of course, was originally 3 stories high in the Brighton Hotel. Totally remodeled in the late 50s. Of course, today Penny's in the downtown hotel, set where the old Majory. And the library, built 1915. Very nice details on it. And the courthouse, built originally in 1858, remodeled extensively in 1888 to about as it looks today. The clock added 1909. Jackson, this building is on the National Register, and I believe these 3 here are. Nothing else on that side is in the National Register. What's behind any of these 10 facades, I have no earthly. They're not on the register, but I do recommend them down to Crawford Street being on the register. particularly Tidwell's and what is now the telephone company. At least what was the telephone company, it's now the police station. But it's been restored and is in beautiful condition. Tidwell's is a very nice building. Although not quite 50 years old, this building was started by the 37-38 City Commission and finished in the 1939-1940 Council. So it's nearly 50 years old. And an interesting building in its own right. None of these buildings are on the register either. It stops with booking company. With the bookshelf right behind the old commercial bank annex building. But a lot of these buildings have nice character. This one has at one point a gorgeous building. It's where the Times and Enterprise used to be. This building is not on the National Register. This is the first one. And the only one on this side of the street on Jackson. This section of Jackson, of course, has been changed so much. All this is on the register. This is on the register. These three different buildings have been put together by Neil. Backside of the church building. Owen Pharmacy, which is now gone out of business. All this section is on the register. Of course, you get to this has been restored. Some pieces very beautifully done. What was it, Drummer's Hotel? This section, of course, could use some work. All this is also registered. The parking lot is not. This section down here is as well. These Thomasville ironworks are all made across the street. Comes on down here to my GA space. This building right here. As far as I know, this particular little building is not on the register, but it is cute. Of course, this building has now been nominated for the National Register and will certainly, I'm sure, be put on the National Register as an individual property. And we'll tie this into Jackson. the rest of Thomasville. The sun's in the wrong direction right now. All this section is on the register. Of course, a lot of these buildings do have very nice details. This is a good case in point. Some don't have a lot. It's also a good case in point. The black here. National Register or not, this house certainly is one of the finest homes in Thomasville. And although this one has been moved, I would think that most people think this would be worth saving. Of course, the Hardy Bryan house. Good case in point of structures that have been changed a great deal. This one has been changed an enormous amount. Corner there. One of the great steeples in Thomasville. And of course, almost no one surpassed Evans and Chase when it came to brickwork. Some of the most gorgeous brickwork in Thomasville is on this building. There's absolutely nothing on the historical grounds with the exception of the garage, which was built in the 1940s, less than 50 years old. Of course, this particular building, if I ever get it restored, dates back to 1893. This structure was at one point a part of this house built by Dr. Humphreys, and it was an enormous structure in its day. This building was originally one story, and I understand that the second floor was added as a wedding present when the Flowers' son married. There was a boarding house at one point in the 1890s. This building is also built right at the turn of the century. It's been remodeled, of course, fairly extensively recently, with this dormer added to the second floor. I think built by a blackshear. This building was built by a friend of C.W. Lapham's. He and his friend, both from Chicago, I don't remember his name, came down and bought this piece of property side by side and went back to Young Street. This house was built by Mr. Dawes of Dawes Silica Mining Company. It's quite an interesting little bungalow. Mr. Ainsworth built this house. He owned the Ainsworth Livery Stable on Jackson, one of the biggest in town. I think one of the more interesting facts is the slate roof here on this building. This building was originally very Victorian, had a round front porch on it, and Dr. Charlie Watt Sr. added the front that's on here now. Miss Fanny Chisholm used to live in this house. I have her car. Most unusual lady. Another Chisholm built this house, but I don't know exactly what kin they were. A druggist at the Mitchell House Hotel by the name of Reese built this house in the 1880s. The Hardaway House, of course, was built by the mayor, the first mayor of Thomasville, 1856. Designed by John Wynn, still one of the few that we can fairly document. Has had some changes done to it over the years, but not a lot. The Walker House, built in the 1880s, was owned for most of its history by Mr. Mel Goodwin. Today, this has absolutely no Victorian hanging down in the front, but it does on the back. Of course, that's a very architectural, dignified term, hanging down. Mitch and Julia Davenport's house has great historical significance from the fact that Mitch and Julia were both born on Pebble Hill into Thomas Jefferson Johnson and William Henry Mitchell. the Satius house, built in the 1830s, 1835 if I remember correctly. Probably the oldest standing house in town. Certainly the oldest one-story. One of the cutest little houses in town. They're on the west side of Dawson. The brown house, built in the 1880s, considered a half house. It has some very nice architectural details on it. The Pittman house was built about 1888 and certainly has, I'm sure, one of the finest porches of any house in town. Ephraim Ponder House, built in the 1850s and in bad need of some paint. One of the great houses in town though. The Ephraim Ponder House, of course, was later used as Young's Female College when Reamer Young's estate bought it in 1869. This building was built about 1905 by the Presbytery, the Presbyterian Church, as the administration building for Young's Female College. Society were organized 1915. This building built 1916. Christian Science Church. Organized 1915. This building built 1916. Built as the Christian Science Church. This beautiful little building was built by Miss Emily Joyner after she sold the house on the back side of the Historical Society. She moved here and built this about 1896. Miss Emily Jugger's house. I'm not sure it was built, it had to be in the 80s. A couple of houses on Washington just behind Emily Joyner's house there off of Dawson are probably in great danger of something happened to them, and they're great little structures. Beautiful architectural detail. This is the house right next door. It's been restored as an office. Has some very nice details as well. Beautifully restored. Beautiful structure. I'm not sure who built this house, but Dr. Hansel Merrill, Judge Hansel Merrill lived here for a while. The Ball House, built about 1886, has some very nice details. The Hawkins House, built in 1891, is an exact copy of the Ball House. And on the other side of the street, of course, is the Presbyterian Church, built in 1889. The Evans and Chase, again, the brickwork of those gentlemen was outstanding. One of the great churches in town. John Dyson's house was a one-story building originally. The second floor was added turn of the century. The James Ransom Reed house, which is now owned by the Rogers, should perhaps be more called the Culpeper Bailey house, because the house that Ransom Reed owned was very Victorian, and this Greek Revival front porch was added in 1906 by Dr. Culpeper. This is the Way house, built around the turn of the century. The posts on this house are fairly interesting. The Burbank Cottage is now owned by Dr. Ben Grace, when he's adding his greenhouse. Built in 1875 by Mrs. Burbank out of Wisconsin. One of the more interesting structures in Thomasville. This Fleming house, built around the turn of the century, 1900. This is the Paxton house, built by a gentleman out of Wheeling, West Virginia in 1884. Cater Parker built this house. He was a lawyer, in with A.T. McIntyre and Son, for one thing. Lawson, of course, lives there now. Dr. Wallace Bruce built this house, and of course Miss Helen Driver lived there for many, many years. This house was built turn of the century for an Alice Ainsley by 1904. This house was built about 1858 by David Harrell, and originally faced Remington. This originally was the front porch. Second floor was added later by Mr. S.A. Roddenberry, who was our congressman. This house was built for Mrs. Fraser Livingston McIntyre, who was Bill McIntyre and Hugh McIntyre's mother. The James Watt house, he was of course in the hardware business, originally had a beautiful dome that was taken off. This is his father-in-law's house, the Augustus Harris Hensel house, designed by John Wynn. Probably one of the finest Greek Revival houses in town, built in 1853. Next door to David Harrell's house is this structure, known as the McCartney House. It was built about 1886. This house also seems to have been built by Mr. David McCartney as well. Actually, it was built by his son Jack. It's also a McCartney house. It was built in the 1890s. This house was built by Mr. R.C. Balfour Sr. Beautiful structure. Cicero Young built this house in the 1890s. Built by the Cobbs, Mr. Cobb, in 1888. Being restored by Mr. George Dixon today. Has some beautiful details. Jones Council House, built in the 1890s. It's now, of course, All Saints Rectory. And of course, All Saints itself was the old Catholic church, built originally in the corner of Jefferson and Crawford. In 1881, moved here a few years ago, 1981. This was built for the sister of Mr. A. H. Hansel across the street, actually Mrs. Hansel, and was built about 1853. The Mason Ball house was built by Mr. Haywood Mason, later owned by Mr. Ball, before Mason went out and bought Susino. This was referred to as Yellow Jacket, for fairly obvious reasons. Interesting scale of the gable there. Charles Hebard Jr. built this house around the turn of the century from one that had burned. It was patterned after a steamship. It's an interesting structure, if nothing else. His father, Charles Hebard Sr., who among other things owned the Okefenokee Swamp, built this house about 1899. Really kind of difficult to see all the details on this house. The columns are enormous. Mrs. Forbes built this house. She loved England, as you can easily see. Mr. Forbes owned a furniture store. Mrs. Forbes taught a kindergarten. Robert Evans built this house in 1898. Had one of the great front doors of the Thomasville. The Cox house. George Cox was out of Wisconsin. Built it about 1891. The Brandon house, built about 1914. The George Neal house, built in 1937. The Kiefer house, built in 1888. Beg your pardon, this was 1895. He came to Thomasville in 1888 and established Thomasville Ice. Justice Strawbridge built this house about 1899 and certainly is probably the finest example of a cottage to be built in Thomasville. Justice owned the Strawbridge and Clothes department store out of Philadelphia. Might call this house cozy if nothing else. Jason Bailey built this house in about 1900. It originally faced Broad Street, and the only thing on the whole block, this house and a barn. Bailey owned Bailey Ice Cream out of Boston, Mass. A couple of Neal houses here. This was built for Meta Neal Bracey. Her husband, Moselle, started Bracey Lumber Company. There have been some additions on the back and some very changes to the front. This wing was added only a few years ago, but it was done very sympathetically. And of course, the front porch has been glassed over, but again, sympathetically. The house next door, of course, now known as the Neal House, was built by Mr. Lee Neal around 1907. Beautiful structure as well, has some very nice details. Of course, all the houses that I've been talking about for the last several minutes face Paradise Park, which is the oldest park in Thomasville. And these pretty well end what I would think is the historic tour of Thomasville. The rest of these houses, this is Mr. Leb Deakel's house. It was built